Welcome to Long Blue Leadership, the podcast where we share insights on leadership through the lives and experiences of Air Force Academy graduates. I'm Navira Walkowitz, class of 99. Our story is about a leader who reached heights fellow Air Force Academy graduates had not reached before her. And this was at a time when opportunities to do so were still new. Join me as we discuss her career in and out of the military. But first, a moment with my guest as she describes the start of her journey to a very special place.
I was in South Dakota as the president of the South Dakota School of Mines, and my cell phone rang, and he said, "This is Jim Mattis, and I want to talk to you about becoming Secretary of the Air Force."
My guest is Dr. Heather Wilson, class of 82. As you heard, she served as the 24th Secretary of the Air Force, but there is a unique distinction attached to that. Dr. Wilson, welcome to Long Blue Leadership. We have so much to discuss. Let's start with you becoming the Secretary of the Air Force, our 24th.
Yeah, that wasn't part of my life's plan. It was pretty clear that I was being called to serve in a way that I didn't anticipate, but that was what I was supposed to do.
What a transformative moment in your life, I'm sure.
Well, it was. Again, my entire life, I think, is a diversion from its planned course. But I turned out, I didn't anticipate that, and it meant my husband doesn't really much like big East Coast cities that rain a lot and have a lot of traffic, and so from a family point of view, it wasn't what we personally wanted to do. But you're called to serve, and we've been called to serve in different ways in our lives, and sometimes even if it feels inconvenient, you're still called to serve. It turned out to be wonderful, and I really enjoyed the experience, both of working with Secretary Mattis, but also getting back to spending time with airmen, and so it turned out to be wonderful, but it wasn't what I expected.
Well, you said it, ma'am. As we know, service and leadership aren't linear. And so we're really excited to dive into some of those experiences today. Maybe share, as Secretary of the Air Force, some of the most monumental or those moments in leadership that stuck with you. Let's just kind of start there.
I certainly could have, there were good days and not so good days. I think one of the things that I really benefited from was that I had a partner in the Chief of Staff, Dave Goldfein, who was absolutely fantastic, and we've remained very close friends. We started at the Academy the same day. And he would joke and tell people that we didn't graduate on the same day because he went stop out for a year, but we didn't know each other well as cadets, but we were formed by some of the same experiences. And I think that helped tremendously. I didn't really understand that in our system of government, the civilian secretary has almost all of the authority, but the chief of staff has almost all of the influence. And if you can figure out how to work together, you can get a heck of a lot done. And Dave and I both had that same approach. And it turned out to be a great partnership.
That's pretty incredible. In fact, the time of your service in that role, I was actually working under your umbrella at US STRATCOM. I was at Strategic Command there as both a government civilian and as a reservist. And so I can certainly speak to, I think, some of the amazing things that you did. Can you share a little, you talked about some ups and downs. What was maybe one of the failures as Secretary of the Air Force that you learned from that helped you throughout your life?
Well, I was, the day, I think it was November 5th, 2017. And it was a Sunday, early or late morning, early afternoon, and my phone rang. I was upstairs in the study in my row house in Virginia, and it was the Inspector General, General Saeed. And that morning, a young man had walked into a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, and opened fire and killed a lot of people. And it turned out he had been an airman. And the general said, we're not sure yet, but he may have been convicted of a crime that would have required us to tell the FBI and the National Criminal Records Check system that he had committed a crime that would not allow him to purchase a weapon, but we may have failed to notify. And we didn't know, we wouldn't know in that afternoon, but I talked to the chief, and we all got together on Monday morning at 9 a.m., and General Saeed confirmed it, that he was an airman. He had been convicted of a domestic violence-related crime, and we had not properly notified the FBI. And as a result, he had been able to buy a weapon. That was not a good day. And we talked about what we should do next. And our general counsel wasn't there he was traveling that morning, but a more junior lawyer was there who suggested and other people said, well, it actually got worse because there was a IG investigation, an internal audit from several years before that showed that all of the services were not properly reporting to the National Criminal Records System. So we hadn't fixed the problem. We knew we had been informed there was a problem and hadn't fixed it. And some people said, well, you weren't here at the time. That doesn't matter. You wear the uniform or you wear the cloak of office, and you have to take responsibility for the institution. And of course, the lawyers would say, well, maybe you want to fuzz this and not take, there's an investigation going on or something. But we knew enough of the facts that morning, Monday morning. And Dave Goldfein and I decided to own it, to own the failure and focus on fixing the problem. And we did. And in the short term, that, was very uncomfortable. We sat in front of the Pentagon press corps and took their questions, and we went to the Capitol Hill and informed the members of Congress on what had been done and not been done and why. But in the long term, by owning failure, we were able to focus on fixing the problem rather than just trying to manage responsibility and accountability. And it turned out to be a much better approach. So sometimes the most important lesson is to own failure.
I'm so glad you shared that, man, because I think some people have a fear of failure, but there are going to be times when failure is inevitable. And to your point, owning it is the right approach. Something you said when you were sharing that, it made me think about us as cadets and our core values, integrity first, and that really resonated with how your approach was. Would you say that was born for you at the academy and kind of through your career, that's where it stayed, or has that always been part of your fabric?
I think the academy was absolutely formative in that way, in the honor code. And, integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do now replaces the what was there when I was a cadet over the archway there. But I think that's woven into the fabric for airmen, and it's part of our culture. And it drives you. And I think, now we look at how do we evaluate officers? It's the same way I now evaluate leaders, any leaders that work with me, and it's the way I evaluate myself. Accomplish the mission, lead people, manage resources, and make your unit better, all on a foundation of values. But it's that last part of it, all on a foundation of values. If you don't have that, the rest of it almost doesn't matter. You can try to make your unit better, but if you're lying about it, nobody's going to trust you. If you're leading people and managing resources, but you don't have integrity, it doesn't matter. So integrity first, and that commitment to trying to be honest and direct with people builds those relationships of trust, which last for decades throughout a career.
Absolutely. And the key word, I think, that foundation you talked about, how has that foundation served you in leadership as you've explored other areas outside of the military? Amazing roles, leading UTEP, also at the South Dakota School of Mines. In higher education, I'm sure that there's a translation of what that looks like. Can you share maybe an example of how that came into play?
Sure, it happens all the time. I think in any leadership position, whether you're in corporate life, in community life, in a nonprofit, or in higher education, leading with a foundation of values, being honest, complying with the law, following the rules, or changing the rules. It doesn't mean that's one of the things that I think is probably important for leaders. You get to a point as a leader where your job is not just to follow the rules, but to look at the systems and identify the rules that need to be changed. But to be direct and honest about that too, where it's not, well, I think this rule doesn't make any sense, so I'm going to skirt it, or I'm not going to tell people that I've complied with something and I haven't. In fact, that happened to me this morning. I got a disclosure that I was supposed to sign for a report that was published, yesterday to the Director of National Intelligence on a committee that I serve on, and they sent this kind of notification on what you can talk about publicly and all of those things. And I hadn't given up my right to speak publicly about unclassified matters, and I responded. I understand what you've said. I want to let you know that this is how I interpret this, and this is the way I'm going to act. I was very direct about it. That I didn't give up my First Amendment rights as a citizen because I worked on your task force. so,
That's right.
so very direct, and I think that directness is something that not all cultures are that way, including higher education culture, and I have to be a little bit careful about that sometimes. The airman's kind of tendency to have a frank debrief isn't always the way other cultures. And work cultures they're just not always like that. So I have to be a little bit careful sometimes that I don't crush people's will to live or something.
I was actually thinking about that as you were speaking, how, if you have that foundation, especially from the military, we kind of understand that directive approach and certainly those core values that we know of. And I'm curious, how do you adapt as a leader to those who maybe don't have that foundation? How do you bring them up to speed and kind of help them establish that?
Well, it's a two-way street. It means that I have to understand the culture that I'm in, and the way in which that I talk with senior faculty may be slightly different than the way I might talk to somebody who just got off a flight line and was too low and slow on final or something,
Yes.
But at the same time, with both a sense of humor and a little bit of grace, I think we can, but it was really funny when I was at South Dakota Mines, my provost was a longtime academic. And of course, I had served in Congress for 10 years as well. And he once said something to me that just made me crack up. He said, you are the least political president I've ever worked with. And the funny thing is, you're the only one that's really was really a politician. And and he said, you remind me more of a military officer. And I thought, yeah, that's probably true. But I was fairly direct as a member of Congress as well. So I've just found that works better for me in life, I guess.
So what was your time like serving in Congress? I mean, that's 10 years you did, I think, correct?
I did. And again, I didn't expect to serve in Congress. My predecessor became very seriously ill shortly before the filing deadline for the election, and that what happened in 1998. And my phone rang. It was a Thursday night. This happens to me. I don't know why, but it was a Thursday night, and my phone rang. I was working in Santa Fe, Cabinet Secretary for Child Welfare, and it was Senator Pete Domenici, the senior senator for the state of New Mexico. And he said, you don't know anything about this, but I'm coming to New Mexico this weekend, and I want to talk to you about running for Congress. Well, that's a quiz. That's not a question, because a quiz has a right answer, which is, sir, I'd be happy to talk to you about whatever you want to talk about, So he's a United States senator. So we did, and talked about all kinds of things. And he called me from the airport when he was heading back to Washington that Sunday night. And he said, look, if you will run, I will help you. And I decided to run. It was 8 days before the filing deadline. I talked to my predecessor and I said, look, he was fighting skin cancer. And I said, look, why don't you just focus on fighting cancer? 2 years from now, if you want to run again, you can have this seat back. I'll try to do my best for the next 2 years. And then 30 days later, he died. I mean, you're not supposed to die of skin cancer.
Right.
And so I ended up serving for 10 years in the Congress in a very difficult swing district that I probably shouldn't have won in the first place. But I enjoyed the service part of it. I enjoyed the policy work part of it. It was intellectually challenging. Some of the partisan silliness I didn't like very much. And then when I left the Congress, ran unsuccessfully for the Senate and became a university president, one of the great things, I tell people now that I was released from Congress early for good behavior. But it was nice to be in a town where, people were waving at me with all five fingers. I mean, it was wonderful. So I enjoyed the service, and I enjoyed a lot helping people and doing casework and things. But it was also a little bit less of a partisan time, and where you could try to listen and learn and serve well and try to serve your constituents without just being, under attack mercilessly in social media or something. That it was
Right.
maybe perhaps a different age.
Well, I chuckled when you said waving with all five fingers. That got like a good one out of me, ma'am. One
Yeah,
of the
that's true.
things that when you're in that, because that wasn't something you were looking to do, and this seems to be a bit of a theme in your
Yeah,
leadership
yeah,
trajectory as well. You've kind of been tapped on the shoulder, and for the ones that you didn't apply for or run for or plan for, have
yeah.
been such transformative positions in your life.
Yeah, and I think maybe that happens to people more than we might acknowledge, because when we're planning our lives, we think we know what's going to happen, but in reality, we adapt to situations that develop, and opportunities open that you didn't know were there, or someone asks you to take on a special project, and that leads you in a direction that you didn't anticipate. So while mine seem particularly unusual in these very different chapters of my life, I don't think it's all that unusual. We look forward and project in straight lines, and when we look backward, we tell a story in a narrative, and it's not always a straight line. But I've been blessed to be asked to do some things, and perhaps in our relationship and in my husband and I, he doesn't like change. I love it, and so he's in our relationship. He's kind of the keel, and I'm kind of the sail, and together we go places.
That is awesome. And I think that particular time and journey in your career serving in Congress was probably one that you established new tools in your leadership toolbox. Were there any that particularly stood out, moments, either when you were having to, forge new policy or get, achieve things that you hadn't, prior, because Congress is a kind of different machine?
Yeah, it's a very big committee, and it's not executive leadership, and so I'm probably more predisposed to executive leadership than just being on committees. But it takes a very long time to get anything done in Congress, and our government is intentionally designed that way to protect us from tyranny. So you have to take that philosophical approach to it, even if you're frustrated day to day. I did learn how to get things done by giving other people credit. And there were several times that the changes to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, probably one example, where I had sponsored legislation in the House. It taken quite a bit of time. There change in Congress. There were continued problems. And I went to others and tried to put them in positions of leadership and support them. And ultimately, it was a Senate bill that passed, but which had been shaped in the background by multiple people, including me. And I was okay with that. And the same thing happened on pieces of legislation about public lands in New Mexico. I remember I came out in favor of doing something in northern New Mexico with respect to some public lands, and I got out ahead of Pete Domenici, and he was not happy about that. He was very clear about not being happy about getting a little bit ahead of him on it. But in the end, the piece of legislation there that was signed and another one on Zio Pueblo were Senate bills. They weren't House bills, but I had moved things forward on the House side, and it didn't matter to me that it said S rather than H in front of the name of the bill. So as long as you don't really care about who gets the credit, you can get a lot done in the Congress.
That is a powerful lesson. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I think there's a Contrails quote, and I can't remember all of it, but I remember the end of it is, if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
That was
certainly.
probably one of the short ones. Schofield's quote was,
Yeah.
we all did push-ups for those.
Yes. Yes. I had a starting moment. I was about to get down and start for myself. Like, well, I don't
Start
remember.
to
Let me
sweat.
just go ahead and
Yeah.
take my punishment. Oh,
I think, when I think about my service in the Congress, where I made the most difference, it was in committee work, and particularly on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, where I served for a significant amount of time, including post 9/11. And I think that work, because the Intelligence Committee is most of it is in private. It's dealing with really hard, really important issues, and you don't bring your staff there. You have to do the work. And I think probably that's where I did some of my most important work as a member of Congress, was in intelligence.
you shared that General Goldfein has kind of been someone that you've leaned on at times. You've worked really well together. Who are some other influencers, some key influencers in your life that have maybe walked alongside you or helped you in these different roles that you carried in your amazing career?
Well, they're different people at different times, but certainly as a young person, my grandfather was very important to me. My grandfather had been one of the first flyers in the RAF in World War I, and then came to America in 1922 and flew in the Second World War for what became the Civil Air Patrol. So he did sub-search off the Atlantic coast and varied parts around to bases in New England, and so he was important to me. As a child, my dad died when I was young. My dad also had been enlisted in the Air Force. He was a crew chief, and also a pilot, commercial pilot after he got out of the service. So I grew up around airplanes, and my grandfather was very important to me. And there were other people along the way. When I was a cadet, there was a group commander, a lieutenant colonel. It's funny, you still remember. Anyone who remembers my middle initial, I know it's like, oh, this may not be good. But
Yes.
Robert L. Rame, Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Rame, he was the fourth group commander, and my first air officer commanding, Major William S. Reeder. He was an Army officer and had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam. Really, I was terrified at disappointing him, I think. It's funny, I just got a Christmas card from him. Life's long, right?
Wow, what connections. I'd like to kind of go back a little bit to your grandfather. You said he was really important to you in your life. Can you share maybe some of the ways he influenced you? Obviously, you're third generation aviator in your family. Is that how you knew you were going to go into service from him?
Well, the academy wasn't an option until I was a junior in high school, and so I knew I was going to college, but I didn't really think about where. And then they opened the Air Force Academy to women when I was a junior in high school. So my grandfather had 2 sons, and he had 5 grandsons, and me, and but he was pretty. I would say the way he might say it, he was pretty sweet on me. He and I were very close. We used to play chess after school when I was in high school, and I remember once we just finished playing chess, and I was a senior in high school, and there was not a tool. So my grandfather was an aviator. He was also a mechanic. He could use any tool. I mean, it was just amazing with his hands, and I had learned a new tool in school, and I took out a piece of graph paper and I drew a curve, and I said, Grandpa, do you think you could find the area under this curve? And he said, well, I'd probably count up the squares and estimate from there on the graph paper. And then I showed him something new, and it was called calculus. And it was the first time in my life that I realized I had a tool that my grandfather didn't have. He had a high school education, and had gone into the RAF during the First World War, and he was a great mechanic and a really good man. But I realized that there were opportunities for me that maybe my grandfather never had.
Wow. I actually got chill bumps when you shared that. Pretty powerful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Can you talk about throughout your career, you said, if people remember your middle initial, and I'm sure that many on the military side would because you're amazing. Have you learned from anyone maybe that is not a mentor of you, but someone that has kind of come under your wing? Can you share some leadership lessons that you've learned from those serving alongside and under you?
Oh my gosh, I learn stuff every day from the people that I'm privileged to work with. And one of the things that I learned over time was, as you get more senior, the most important thing you do as a senior leader is hire good people who know things that you don't know. Because it's not possible to know everything you need to know to lead a large organization. So you have to organize yourself well and then get great people and let them do their job. So I learn things every day. I was interviewing somebody yesterday that we're trying to attract to come to the university who is it's on the communication side of things, and marketing and communication and branding, and that creative visual side of my brain. If you did a brain scan, it would be like a dark hole. I mean,
Well, you can't be all things, man. So.
Yeah, that's not not a strength of mine. And so those kinds of things are you have to realize what your strengths are, and then hire to fill in the team and put together a team which together can accomplish the mission.
I'd say that your grandfather is still kind of, influencing that. It's almost like you're filling your toolbox with all of those areas that you don't have.
Yeah, it's funny you use that word. And I've told this story before, but my father was both a pilot and a mechanic, and he built an experimental aircraft in our house, and we lived on this kind of the last house that they would plow to on the end of the road in the winter, right? So in a very small town, and at that time there were still traveling salesmen, and the Snap-on tools guy would come probably every 6 weeks or so, and he had
those red trucks, right? Snap-on
right?
tools?
He had
Okay.
had this like red truck with an accordion hinge to the back that looked just like the toolbox in the corner of the garage, right? And we knew that when the Snap-on tools guy came, do not go out in it. I mean, it was like Christmas for my dad. Do not interfere when the Snap-on tools guy is there. And so he'd go out and, lean against the truck, and you could see him laughing and stuff. And eventually my dad would, reach in his pocket and pull out his billfold and, give the guy a bill, and he'd go back and he'd lift up the back of the accordion thing and reach in there and give my dad a tool. And my dad would, and then he'd bet, the truck would back out and he'd go on to his next stop. But my dad would, take that tool, and we'd scramble into the garage to see what he got and stuff. And my dad would usually put that tool in the box in the corner and then go back to what he was doing that day, working on his car or whatever he was doing. And it occurred to me that my dad didn't need that tool that day, but he collected tools. And someday he'd need that tool. And I think great leaders collect tools, even when they don't need them today. Because there are going to be times when you bring everybody to, there's that great scene in Apollo 13, but it happens around the staff and cabinet table, and it'll happen in your planning room as a pilot where you've got a new problem, and everybody brings in their tools and says, okay, how can we make a carbon monoxide filter or carbon dioxide filter out of what we've got here on the table? So collect tools. And I think that's one of the things I learned from my dad.
Oh, that is an amazing story. Can you share maybe a tool that you've had in your toolbox that you learned way back when, maybe at the academy or as a young girl that you've recently pulled out and used?
Well, one of them, maybe I'm not so sure it's recent, but when I was a small business owner, there was a group in New Mexico called Quality New Mexico, and they taught small business owners the Baldrige principles for quality management. And then I ended up being the cabinet secretary for child welfare in New Mexico. So I took over a foster care system, which was under a federal consent decree for not getting kids forever homes, and a overly crowded juvenile justice system. I mean, every intractable social problem was. I realized after a while why I became cabinet secretary for child welfare is because nobody else wanted that job. I mean, it was a really difficult job, but I had these tools on quality management. I thought, I think we can apply these same principles to improving foster care, to improving the juvenile justice system, and so we did. And probably there's some things I was proud of there, but one of my last acts as cabinet secretary before I ended up leaving and running for Congress was to sign the end of the federal consent decree that had been in place for 18 years that said that the state was not getting foster kids forever homes, and we changed the system. But we did it using those quality management principles, which I had learned as a small business owner almost as a lark. So there's one example. But we just went through a global pandemic. It was very much a pickup game. Nobody had ever been through that. So we all got together and figured out how we could use the tools we had, including the research capability on my campus to be able to sequence DNA so that we could do testing on campus and get the results ultimately within 6 hours, and then feed that back into so we could detect disease before someone was symptomatic, so you could suppress disease on campus for those who had to be on campus. So there's some things you can't do remotely. And so we had our own testing system on campus, which was remarkable. Well, why'd we have that? Well, because we had some tools in the box.
Well, you've used those tools amazingly as you've navigated your career. How would you say that, because yours is, we talked about not being linear, it's kind of been multiple paths and
different
ways.
Chapters. Yeah.
Yes, different. Oh, I love that. Different chapters. How would you say that you've navigated leadership through that? Has there been a thread that's been common through all of those different chapters that you've kind of leaned into?
We talked a little about integrity, and that certainly is there. But when people say things like, why are you at UTEP, or why did you shift to higher ed, or why did you should, the mission matters. So developing people matters. Defending the country matters. So a mission that matters with people I like. And I realized that when you get down to it, you should do things that matter with people you like. And if that's your filter, as long as you can put food on the table, there's a lot of different things you can do. But it should be something that matters with people you like. Otherwise, life gets that time between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. can seem forever unless you're doing something you like.
That is a powerful thread. I love that mission that matters with people you like. How has your family supported you through this?
I live a blessed
these
life.
Different chapters.
So the most important decision I've made in my life is not to go to the academy or to become to run for Congress or to become a college president. None of those things are the most important decision I've made in my life. The most important decision I made in my life was to marry the guy I married. I married well. Married a guy who he's actually retired Air Force now, but he was a lawyer. Despite that, he's a nice guy. And but we, sometimes I think particularly for women, there's always that fear that you're going to sit down when you're getting into a serious relationship, and it's going to be one of those conversations that says, okay, we're thinking about making this permanent. Who's going to give up her career? Right?
Yeah, right. Her
and
career,
it's not
exactly.
really a conversation,
Right.
or at least maybe it wasn't in my era. But Jay never had that conversation with me. It was always we could do more together than either of us could do alone. And he has been so supportive of me, and vice versa. But I had to go back east for something last week, and I knew that even in this big reception that I was in with all these people, that he wasn't going to be there, and if he was, he'd still be the most interesting guy in the room. So I married well. And my family we're a very close family. And I think while my obligations to my family didn't end at the front porch, my family gave richness and dimension to my life that I never really anticipated as a young woman. And it's given me joy, and not, success seemed possible to achieve. Joy always seemed like a gift from God. And I have had joy because of my family.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, you talk about when you're hiring, you choose people that kind of fill gaps, but it sounds like also on your personal team, you want to make sure that you're choosing it, for your life partner.
You're going to be roommates for a long time.
Exactly.
That matters.
Exactly.
And also, there's the things that you just kind of have to get over. I'm not going to clean around his sink, and he's not going to be bothered about the fact that my closet's color coordinated. I mean, we just live with that, right?
I appreciate that about you so much. Yeah. You talked about a minute ago about kind of some things you learned about yourself as a leader. You're like, maybe I should, not take myself so seriously. Can you share a little bit more about that journey on your own, like that personal leadership journey that you've made?
Yeah, and I think it's easier as you go on. I mean, and honestly, very early on, I was very often the only woman in the room. And so I wanted to be taken seriously. I was also very often the youngest person in the room. And so those two things made me want to be taken seriously. As I went on and got more responsibility, I realized that the truth is I am a very serious and successful woman. My husband would say that I was raised in the home for the humor impaired, and that I've been in therapy with him for over 30 years. So I gradually learned to be to see the humor in life. I still am not one that stands up and tells jokes or something, but I see the humor in life, and I don't take myself too seriously. The person that I watched who used self-deprecating humor better than any leader I've ever seen was actually Dave Goldfein. Everyone knew when he walked into a room, or if he stood up on a stage at a town hall meeting with a bunch of airmen or something, everybody knew that they were going to laugh. At some point in that meeting, we're going to laugh. And not at someone else's expense, but at his. And it made people relax around him. And he was very, very good at it. But I also knew that his self-deprecating humor was really a cover for exceptional competence. And I never underestimated that. But it made people relax and brought a little bit of joy to whatever intractable problem we were looking at.
Well, you shared about sometimes when you're coming up through your leadership, you were often the only woman in the room and sometimes the youngest in the room. Yeah. What would you like to share on your thoughts of what has that impact been, and what do you see as your legacy?
Well, there were some times, particularly early on, when women flying or women in positions of command was new, where you just had to do the job and realize that you were probably changing attitudes as you went, and that it would be easier for those who came after you. And that's okay. I don't see that as much anymore. Although when I was elected to Congress, I think probably 10-15% of the House was women. Now it's more than that. And once it gets to be more than 30% in any room, it doesn't sound, it's almost like you walk into a restaurant where it's all guys or all women, and you notice the difference in the room, the tones of the voices and things. Once you get to about a third, it feels like it's comfortable. But early on, I always was very conscious of it, and conscious of the obligation to do well, so that because I was being judged not only for myself but for an entire group of people. And so I was sensitive to that and wanted to make sure that I didn't, don't shame the family, right? So make sure that you keep the doors open. As far as legacy is concerned, and I think back on my time as Air Force Secretary, I would say there's two things that I hope linger, and they have so far. One is a change to the promotion system to make sure that we have the right kind of talent to choose from at all levels in the organization. And so that, I think, has continued to persist. And the other one that will be changed over time and has to be changed over time had to do with the science and technology strategy of the Air Force, and the need to stay ahead of adversaries. I think this is a completely separate conversation, but I actually think that we are at greater risk of scientific and technical surprise today than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And if you go back and read books about, engineers of victory, or there's a whole lot of books about how science and technology was brought to bear in prevailing in the Second World War. I think we're at risk now in a way that we've kind of become complacent about. So science and technology strategy is something that I hope is a legacy.
Oh, that's amazing, ma'am. And I think not only for our military, but you're able to influence that in the spaces that you are now.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Engaging the next generation, which
right.
is a heck of a lot of fun. University of Texas at El Paso is a wonderful institution, 25,000 students. Half of them are the first in their families to go to college.
Oh, wow.
About 70% or so come from families making less than about $45,000 a year. So this is a university that transforms lives. And it's a university that, of my 25,000 students, over 5,000 are studying engineering. Another couple of thousand are studying science, College of Nursing, College of Education. This has a tremendous impact on the region and on the lives of those who choose to educate themselves. And so it's it's a wonderful mission to be part of, and I think it's important for the nation. I think regions of the world who choose to educate their people in the 21st century will thrive, and those that don't are going to be left behind. And that's why I do what I do.
Well, it clearly aligns with your foundation and your mission, ma'am, and I think that's outstanding. Well, we're going to ask for Dr. Wilson's final thoughts next, but before we do, I'd like to take a moment and thank you for listening to Long Blue Leadership. The podcast publishes Tuesdays in both video and audio and is available on all your favorite podcast platforms. Be sure to watch, listen, and subscribe to all episodes of Long Blue Leadership at longblueleadership.org. So, Dr. Wilson, I would love to take a moment to gather some of your final thoughts, what you'd like to share today.
Well, assuming that most of the folks who listen to this are either cadets or young officers or grads, I'd leave them with one thought, and that is don't shame the family. Don't shame the family. People will look up to you because you are an Air Force Academy graduate or you are an Air Force cadet. The standard is higher, so live up to the standard.
Man, we started with you being direct. You ended direct. I think that is amazing. Thank you very much. Thanks for being on Long Blue Leadership.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Long Blue Leadership. The podcast drops every 2 weeks on Tuesdays and is available on all your favorite podcast apps. Send your comments and guest ideas to us at socialmedia@usafa.org. and listen to past episodes at longblueleadership.org.